right, for if anybody's just jumping in, definitely recommend looking over the GitHub repository that's pinned on top of the Discord. Just move that down here for a second. It's pinned on top of the Discord is obviously the link to the Zoom, but you're already on it, as well as the link to the GitHub repository. I'm actually going to use this GitHub repository. So every code example that I'm going to do, because I'm using Sinatra, which is a super simple framework, I literally am going to upload every line of code that I'm writing to this very same repository. I'm just going to make a file and push it up there. So when you're doing exercises, you'll have access to all the code that I'm writing. So make sure that you are looking at that. The README over there goes over some of the technologies that you'll use, but I'm pretty sure if you're here at RailsConf, you probably have Rails installed, Ruby installed. So the two gems that we'll be using is Sinatra and HTTP. We might use a couple of other small gems here and there. There's a gem called Rerun, which allows you to restart your server, stuff like that. If you're more comfortable with Rails, I'll be doing all the examples in Sinatra just for the sake of simplicity, but you're more than welcome to basically follow along using your own framework of choice. You don't have to use the HTTP gem if you're familiar with, whatever HTTP library you're more comfortable with, HTTP party, or I don't know how to pronounce that one, but feel free to use whatever libraries of choice. Okay, it looks like we'll get started in a bit. We'll probably give people another minute or so to get rolling in, but we'll get started pretty soon after that. And just as a heads up, you all probably know this, but the workshops are being recorded. One of the advantages of doing the online format, because the workshops almost never, I think have never been recorded historically in the past. So you all will be able to reference anything that I'm going over. It's being recorded since Marty was on here, so we've got all that nice awkward silence up front. That's going to be fun to watch in case you wanted to go over any of that stuff. Okay, well, I'll go over some logistics before we get fully started. So yeah, this is the OAuth 2.0 Deconstructed workshop. Just in case anybody wants to bail out on the last second, it won't hurt my feelings at all. So I just want to make it very clear who's going to benefit from this workshop is going to be anybody who's familiar with, you don't have to be an expert. I would say if you're at a beginner level of Rails, you know how to make web requests, you know how to make a Rails app. This workshop will give you a better idea of how to use OAuth. Some of you might have built OAuth implementations using OmniAuth, which is a gem that simplifies the process. And some of you might want to continue using something like that. This workshop is going to be more like, Ruby under the microscope kind of mentality, where it's like, let's figure out how all this stuff works under the hood. By the time you're done with this workshop, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use those types of higher level libraries. It means that you'll be able to better understand what those libraries are doing, understand the OAuth terminology, and understand how to use OAuth in different contexts. There's a lot of really cool applications to OAuth outside of the Ruby on Rails world. Like, I think I've used OAuth in like a Google script where I made a spreadsheet in a Google document, and I wrote JavaScript to automate that spreadsheet, and then I used OAuth to connect to my Trello account and automatically make Trello cards based off of the things that came from my Google Calendar, connecting all these services together without using, any libraries other than just making web requests. So this is really breaking down all the web requests necessary for OAuth and all the terminology that comes with it. And really, I think it can be very intimidating if you're just reading the specification, because there's so much terminology to it. It seems really intimidating, but actually, if you know how to make web requests, it's not super complicated to get started with. All right, I will do my best, by the way, to keep the Discord open. All the chatting should happen on Discord. You can feel free to give me thumbs ups on Zoom if we have any sections like that. And the way the workshop's going to be broken up, I'm going to probably be lecturing for maybe 15, 20 minutes at a time, and then we'll do some exercises. While I'm coding, I would actually recommend you don't try and code and follow along, because I will literally push up all of my code to GitHub, so you'll be able to reference that. But definitely when I'm like signing up for applications, I'm going to sign up, I'm going to create a new GitHub application with OAuth credentials. You can definitely follow along with those sections, but I'll basically stop every 20 minutes or so, roughly speaking, to give everybody a chance to try and code up what I'm coding. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So this is the OAuth 2.0 Deconstructed workshop. My name is Peter Jang. I don't really use social media too much, but if I did, you would find me at PeterXJang. It's my GitHub, Twitter. I signed up for an Instagram account recently with that Twitter or with that handle just because I didn't want anybody else to take it. So PeterXJang at most places. I am the Dean of Instruction and lead instructor at the Actualized Coding Bootcamp. I've been there for about 5 years now. And I've been a developer. I first started coding in 1998, so a long time ago. So I've been a developer for a while, and I've also been an instructor for almost 10 years now, I would say. So that's who I am. What you are here for is to talk about what is OAuth. So most of y'all probably are familiar with what OAuth is, but in case you are not, this is OAuth. Here's a service called Netlify, and the developers at Netlify implemented OAuth so that you can log into their service. Netlify does static website hosting, and you can log into their service using different services. So basically, they've implemented the standard email password type of, authentication authorization, but you can also log in using GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket. And they chose these particular providers because they want to connect their service to those online repository services. So the OAuth process would look like this, where it's like, instead of me making my own account on Netlify, I log in to Netlify using my GitLab account. I click on this link and it takes me to, it redirects me out of Netlify's site into GitLab's site. And here I enter my GitLab username and password. So I am logging in to a service, not on the original site that I came from. There's a lot of security implications that come with this. I remember reading about some OAuth history, and people basically before OAuth, if you were Netlify and you wanted to build this, people made websites where they said, please give me your Google username or email and password, and then we'll do some backend code and send that to Google and log in, which is hugely, hugely insecure. So the whole idea of OAuth is redirecting you to the actual service so you can sign in on that service, redirecting you back in a secure fashion, right? And the whole protocol that people developed is literally just how to do that in a secure fashion. So here, if I try to log in with GitHub, I believe I'm already logged into GitHub, and then it takes me straight back to Netlify, and there was a whole process that happened right there, sort of invisible to the user, right? And the reason why I want to use OAuth is that now that I'm logged into Netlify, I have a couple of sites that are connected both to Netlify and using authorized requests to my GitHub account. So I have some GitHub repositories, and every time I push to those GitHub repositories, Netlify automatically can rebuild my site. So it's deeply connected to that service. So we want to build that. We want to build, I can't do this now, I got to log out. We want to build this, right? And we're not going to build this. Basically, the purpose of this tutorial is not to build a pretty front end. It's literally just to show you that process. So if you Google, what is OAuth from a developer's perspective, you'll more than likely see a diagram like this, which is wildly, to me, it's wildly overwhelming. Like, all of these things we're actually going to cover in this workshop, but this is not a good starting point. There's just so much terminology, and there's just like okay, there's a resource on a client, this, and there's something so much back and forth, and really nothing happens until you get down to here. So you have to figure out all this runaround, and it's really not as confusing as it may seem. If you talk to most developers who implement OAuth from scratch, I would say most of them say it's difficult because there's so many different web requests that you're making. If you have a typo in any one of them, like the whole thing falls apart. But each of these web requests have a very specific purpose. So let's break this down first, and then let's do this in code. I'm going to greatly simplify this diagram. So if there's any OAuth 2.0 protocol experts in the audience, you're going to be horrified by my simplification, but please bear with me. I'm just trying to sort of give me a starting point of understanding what all of these different requests are. So I'm going to break it down into basically a client and a server. So on the client, that's where you have this sign in with GitHub button, right? So you're the developer. Let's say I'm making an app called Peter XJang, site or whatever that is. I'm building my application. I'm responsible for building this button. This button, well, it's basically just a link that takes me to the service that I want to authorize with. In this case, I want to use GitHub and log in to my site using GitHub credentials. So the very first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to make a web request to GitHub to get requests. So I'm basically redirecting off of my site onto GitHub's site. And this is something that you all saw with Netlify. I guess we can use that terminology. So this client, let's pretend is Netlify. You're an app developer working for Netlify. And the first thing you do is just build a link. It's easy enough. You have to read the documentation to know what the URL for that link is. That's called the authorization code URL. And you have to give it certain parameters, which we're going to build right now. On the authorization server, you don't have to do any of this. This has already been built out. So GitHub has implemented the OAuth standard. So they already built this page. You log into that page. Once you actually log in, then GitHub is going to give you a screen that looks like this that says, hey, are you really, do you really want to authorize this request? Somebody's asking, should this be a post request? Not the first request, but the second one. We'll see what that looks like. So the first request is just sending them to this page. Then when they say, I do want to authorize, I am on the wrong website at this moment. I'm on github.com. I need to get back to my website. So whoever implements the the OAuth protocol needs to send me back. And so you'll see the second web request. The second web request sends me straight back to my original website, and they embed some information up in the URL. And we're going to see this exact process. And basically, they give you a code as a query parameter in your URLs. On some level, we could be done here. I redirect it to GitHub. GitHub sends me back. GitHub, they log into GitHub, so I don't have to manage the passwords or the usernames or anything like that. GitHub shows this authorization screen, all this happening on GitHub. And then when they click authorize, GitHub redirects me back and sends me this little chunk of information. And some versions of OAuth, that you're done. That's basically your authorization token. So if anybody's familiar with JWTs, if anybody's familiar with API keys, this concept of now you have this token, and now you can use that token to authorize any future web request. That's not how OAuth works. But that you could consider that to be a simplified version of OAuth, right? I sent them to GitHub, so I'm not dealing with their usernames and passwords. The user logs in, they authorize, and then they send back my token. The problem with this, and some people are mentioning this in the Discord, is that all of this is happening with GET requests. So that token is highly insecure. I have this token, it's sitting in my query parameter in my browser URLs. Anybody can intercept this traffic. My internet service provider might be able to pull that information down. So if I just said, hey, if GitHub just sent me some sensitive piece of information, it's like, cool, use this token for every future web request to be authorized in every future web request, you'd sort of be screwed. That's sort of not a secure protocol. So you're going to do one more web request. You're going to say, cool, now I have this code, which is just an intermediary step. I'm going to send that code back to the authorization server, this time as a post request. And I'm also going to send it like client secret and basically some more hidden information that only my server knows. And then the authorization server is finally going to send back the actual access token. So if you're not familiar with using access tokens, I guess it's It's basically, you know, encoding in some chunk of data, you know, this token that you're saying like, this is essentially going to be your username and password. Once you have this token as a developer, you are now, this is the user's, you know, piece of information. Consider this access token to be like the user's username and password without you actually seeing their username and password. Once you have that access token, you are allowed to make web requests as that user. If you implement OAuth for like Twitter and you build your site, like I'm building peterxshang.com and I build OAuth for Twitter, once they log in with Twitter and I get back that access token, I can tweet as that user. I can delete that user's tweets. I can do different things as that user. So this is essentially the whole runaround is basically so that you have embedded in some chunk of string, some string is essentially their username and password without you ever actually getting their username and password. That's the purpose of OAuth. All right. And that's pretty much it. Once I have the access token, then I can do things on my client, like, you know, pull up GitHub stats and create repositories as that user or different things. So originally I showed you this diagram. There's a lot of different web requests going back and forth, but we're simplifying it down to basically these three. First web request is just a link that takes me to the site. Second web request is coming back to me where the authorization server sent me a code. And the third is this, what seems like a useless runaround, but I want to convert that insecure code into a secure access token. If you're just learning OAuth for the first time, that's a lot of stuff that I went over. So I'm done talking. Let's just start building. Well, I'm not done talking, but I'm done. I'm doing slides. Let's start building this out. So let me pull this off to the side. And again, this is the same GitHub repository that I used for the README. And I'm just going to make a new file in here. And I'm going to call it let's just call it GitHub example.rb. And here I'm going to actually write code to implement OAuth, exactly what you're seeing here for GitHub. I guess before I do that, I should show you GitHub's documentation on how they implemented OAuth. So they're basically describing the same flow. So there are 3 web requests that I mentioned. Here's the first one. I need to make an app that has a link that takes me to this site. I'm just going to literally copy and paste that link. And it says that page is not found because you need to give it some more information. But I basically need to build this link. In order to build this link, I'm going to need a client ID, which is required, and nothing else. So I'm going to basically register for an OAuth application and then use that information in order to build an app that, that can use OAuth. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to, if you haven't already done this, I'm going to send this out in Discord. Y'all can go ahead and follow me doing these steps. I'm going to register a new OAuth application. So I'm just going to call it test application. I'm going to make sure it doesn't have the same name. Homepage URL. I'm going to use localhost 4567. That's the default port for Sinatra. The application description is optional. And then the authorization callback URL. I'm just going to keep it simple, http://localhost4567/callback. A more standard callback would be like /auth/github/callback. But this is going to be the link that's necessary. You're basically telling the authorization server where to send you back. And you can put any URL you want to. As soon as this is done, it's just going to go to the URL you told it to go to. So I'm going to slow down right here. This is the information that I am using, and I'll send that out in Discord. Application name can be, you know, whatever. Homepage URL. I'm personally using this. And my authorization callback URL.
Could you please switch to the editor back?
Sorry?
From
I'm just putting in this information here. You can edit this information after the fact. So if you made any mistakes, then it's not a big deal. I'm going to go ahead and register this application. And now I have a client ID and a client secret. I don't have a client secret, so I'm going to go ahead and generate a new client secret. So there's two pieces of information that are necessary. The client ID basically is the identification of my application. This is not a secret piece of information. People are going to see my client ID in my URLs. This is basically a public piece of information. The secret piece of information is a client secret. That has to be something that's kept on the back end that people don't have access to. That's going to enable you to generate these secure access tokens. So I'm going to go ahead and generate a new client secret. I'll have to enter my password into GitHub. None of you should be seeing this client secret right now. And I hope nobody spends the time to copy and paste all of that. Because if you do, then you'll be able to make web requests as me in my app. And they're telling you, by the way, once you do this, you can copy this. But the moment you leave this page, you're not ever allowed to see your own client secret. That's how much they're trying to keep this piece of information secure. I'm going to leave this open right now. And as soon as this workshop is over, I'm going to delete this application so that people can't make web requests as me. But now that I have that information, I'm going to go back to the documentation over here. And it says, what I need to do is I need to make this link and provide a client ID. I guess I can show this to you right here in a browser. If you make this link and provide client ID equals, and then my client ID, that page does exist. That is the first part of the OAuth process. It's literally just building a link. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and put this out in Discord if anybody wants to try it, but you have to put your own client ID in there. You shouldn't use my client ID. I have 3 underscores there. If you click on that link, it's not going to take you anywhere. But if you put your own client ID, you'll see this part. You don't have to do anything going forward. But understand, OAuth is essentially 3 web requests. I've simplified it down to 3 important web requests. There's obviously more. This is the first one. This is you sending the user to the appropriate page. And when you see your own information, I called it test application. You can see my name here and it says what you want. Like, this means you successfully completed the first part of OAuth. I'm going to turn this into code because the next parts of OAuth are going to require post requests and I can't test it out in my browser. You can test this out using, tools like Postman or Insomnia or something like that. But let's start building this in terms of code. And as soon as I'm done with that, which is going to be in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to give you all some time to write this code yourselves. So at this point, I wouldn't recommend following along, but I'm just going to start building out my Sinatra app. So you'll be able to follow along right afterwards. So here's that. I made a new file, gem install Sinatra, if you haven't already done it. Sinatra, gem install Sinatra. I already have it installed. And so now that I have the Sinatra gem installed, I can start building an application. In order to use Sinatra, require Sinatra get /do ERB, which one? I like Sinatra as a way of teaching people stuff because there's nothing else. Literally, this is it. If you've never used Sinatra before, it's really amazing just to be like, here, how do you run this? You say Ruby GitHub example.rb, and you have a localhost 4567, and you can see your application on localhost 4567. Sinatra's super cool. If you're more comfortable using Rails, by the way, feel free to use Rails. This is a super easy way for me to share the code and make sure that everybody's seeing exactly what they need to be seeing, right? I want you just to be focusing on the OAuth part, and Sinatra is just getting out of my way. So instead of just making an H1 tag that says hello, I'm going to make a link. again, I am going to commit this to GitHub and send this all to you momentarily. So I would not recommend trying to follow along at this point, but I can't stop you. And I'm just going to save this and hit refresh. This is important to know about Sinatra. Sinatra is so bare bones, it doesn't give you what Rails gives you. It doesn't automatically restart your server. Anytime you change your code, you're going to have to kill your server and rerun it. There's solutions to that, and we're going to see that later on. But for right now, just to keep things super simple, I changed my code, kill my server, rerun my server, hit refresh. I have a link, but I need to actually make my link go somewhere. So my link is going to go to exactly what I did over here. So that's the link that I got from the documentation with the query parameter with my client ID. Those of you who are familiar with using client CD secrets and client IDs, like you shouldn't put this stuff in your code. And I'm going to push this stuff to GitHub, but I'm not going to put this stuff in my code. I'll show you how to handle that in a second. But I'm just going to do this for the sake of simplicity, and then I'll change it afterwards just to make sure everything's up and running. I hit refresh. I have this link, and this link takes me, that's the first step of OAuth in an actual application. Cool. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and authorize. This is cool because we actually have the first two steps done. If I click authorize Peter Jang, it looks like my app is broken, but it's not. It did exactly what I wanted it to do. And you have to look up here to see that. Once I authorize Peter Jang, my GitHub application redirected me back to exactly where I told it to redirect me back. Redirect me back to localhost 4567/callback, and it added this query parameter right in there. It gave me an extra piece of information. Sinatra's complaining because I didn't implement that URL. I didn't implement that verb URL combination. So I'm going to implement that. Now that I have this code, what do I want to do with this code? I want to make one last web request. So I'm already done. This code alone means I'm done. Oops. Means I'm done with the first two parts of OAuth. The first web request is me just making a link. Everything else is happening on GitHub. GitHub makes a second web request back to me. I just have to implement what do I want to do when I get that callback URL. Some of you might have registered a different callback URL. So your code might look different than mine, but I'm going to register /callback. If I ever get this code, what do I want to do? According to the original slides, what I want to do is I want to make a post request, and this is what the documentation says as well. So the first thing that I did, I finished this. I added the client ID. There's like redirect URI, scope, state, all this extra stuff. We'll come back to this. This is what makes OAuth complicated. There's a lot of extra stuff that you need to know for security purposes. We will get to that, but not right now. I want to just see OAuth in its simplest form. So we did the first step. The second step, users are redirected back to your site by GitHub. And now that the user's redirected, you need to send a post request with that code. And you need to send extra pieces of information, 3 pieces of information: the code, the client ID, and the client's secret. Only your backend knows the client's secret. So you're going to convert an insecure code, which you just got, into a secure access token. That's the OAuth process. That is it. Once you have that access token, you're not done, but you can use that access token to do anything as that user. Okay. So that was step 1. Step 2, if I'm here, I am, if you haven't already installed it, gem install HTTP. I'm going to use the HTTP library to make web requests. But if you're more familiar with HTTP Party or Unirest or whatever it is, you can feel free to substitute that instead. But I'm going to use the HTTP library, which is pretty user-friendly, also very performant from what I understand. And I'm going to make my response equals http.post, essentially this. I want to do what GitHub says, make a post request to this URL. But I need to provide extra information. Once I have this post request, I'm going to have the access token in the response. this is about as far as I'm going to do the code before I'm going to give you all time to get caught up. So for those of you who are scrambling to type along with me, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's up to you. Before I do that, I want to make sure that my headers come back as accepts application JSON, just because I want to get back the access token as JSON. You don't have to do that. And before I submit my post request, I'm also going to need to send form parameters. So these are the pieces of information that they were saying. I need to send the client ID, the client secret, and the code. Let me format this a little bit. Sure. This is the first part of OAuth. The second part automatically comes back to me. So here's the third part of OAuth. I am making the web request to convert my insecure code, which I have in my query parameters, into a secure access token. The client ID is this. Oops, as a string. The client secret is from GitHub, which nobody should be seeing. And this is horrific that you all can see this. And I'm a little bit, scared of what people might do with that, but I'll survive. And the code came from my browser. So I need to pick this code out of my browser's URL, but like Rails, Sinatra has access to any query parameters, and you just say params code. So if anybody's familiar with Rails, automatically picks those query parameters and builds a hash out of it. And that's it. Before I move forward, the way you use the HTTP gem, if you're getting back JSON, you have response.body, but this one's a little bit weird. You say response.parse to parse the body into JSON. So I'm just going to pretty print that to the screen. If you're not aware, PP is just pretty print, and then redirects to / it's not like Rails. I don't know why it's 2 words instead of 1. Right, so I'm just going to redirect back to my home page. I'm going to try and start this whole process all over again. I'm going to kill my server. Super annoying. We're going to fix that, but whatever. Kill my server. And I'm really not going to write much more code other than this because I want y'all to have a chance to get caught up with me. Start off at my home page. It says authorize GitHub. I click authorize GitHub. It looks like nothing has happened. But on my back end, I got that access token. That's the secret sauce. Now I can do anything. I'm going to show you what I mean when I say I can do anything. I'm going to do something with it. So instead of redirecting me back there, this is not where I should write this code. I just want to show you as an example. My access token is response.parse. It was called access token. And here, I'm done. I'm done. I can use that access token to make authenticated web requests. I'm going to show you what that would look like. I think GitHub has an example in their documentation. Now you have the access token, and now you can make web requests and get information about that specific user who just logged in. If you make a GET request to this URL, like right now, I'm going to make a GET request to that URL, and it says requires authentication. So here's a URL that anybody can go to, but unless you have an access token for a particular user, this URL is useless. But I have an access token, so I should be able to get this information. And you have to put the access token in the headers. Yes? Yeah, you have to put the access token in the headers. So I'm going to give you an example of that as well. And then I promise you, I'll give you time to work on this. All right. So I have gotten to here. I do have an access token. I already printed it out. I'll leave this line here. I'm just going to grab the access token out of here. You got to be careful. And this is super important. OAuth is difficult because, I think if you make this a symbol, it wouldn't work because the data is all strings. If you forget to put the client secret, if you have a typo in any one of these parts, all of this falls apart and it's very difficult to debug. That's what makes OAuth difficult. Conceptually, I actually don't think OAuth is difficult at a conceptual level. It's difficult because there's so much terminology. It's difficult because there's so many steps, and each of those steps is very delicate. But conceptually, it's just give me a secure code. I got to go through the steps to make that secure code. Now that I have the access token, I can do something like response equals HTTP dots this way, dot headers dot gets. Here's the URL I want to go to. This really shouldn't be happening at this space. I just want to make this as simple as possible. Authorization token, and then I'll string interpolate the token that I just got. And then I'll just pp response.parse. Yeah, then I guess I'll redirect you back to your homepage. Instead of redirecting you back to your homepage, I could display this information to the user. I can do a lot of stuff right here. But you all saw, if I don't have an access token, I would get back something like this. But since I do have an access token, I now should be able to get the user's name, their profile picture, all that kind of stuff. So about 26 lines of code. That's not too bad. I'll try this process all over again. Over here, I'm going to restart my server, run it all over again. Before I go anywhere, I'm going to just clear out my terminal, and let's see this happen at the same time. If I click authorize GitHub, I just made an authorized web request. Hopefully I don't have anything embarrassing in here. And it's able to pull out my information, my avatar, and I can display this on the page using an image tag, how many followers or what my Twitter, I don't know, all this kind of stuff is an authenticated web request. And I could create new repositories as me. I can create a comment. I can create pull requests. I can basically build an entire GitHub application now that I went through these steps. Hopefully you all see the beauty of it. Ignoring all of this, it's really just up to line 20 is my OAuth implementation. It's just a link. And then what do I do with the code that I got back? Cool. Before I push up my code, this is it. This is it. But before I push up my code, I don't feel comfortable with my tokens sitting there. So I'm going to replace these with environment variables. For those of you who are familiar with like the Figaro gem or Rails credentials or anything like that, I'm basically going to do this in a very, very simplified way. I'm going to copy this and go into my terminal, kill my server, and I'm just going to export it as a variable. I'm going to call this GitHub client ID equals this. So for those of you who are less familiar with Bash or whatever shell you're using, this is basically making a variable on your computer. The moment I close this terminal tab, these variables go away. This is not a sustainable way of doing it. This is just what I'm doing for right now. You should be saving this in a .env file or using the Figaro gem or something. But for right now, just for the purposes of this demo, and you all can do the same, you're just exporting it into your computer's terminal tab. It will literally go away if you open up a new terminal tab. Some people will add it to their Bash profile or their Bash RC. Some people will make a separate .env file, however you want to handle this. I'm going to do the same thing. Export GitHub client secret equals that. Now they're in my environment, and the way I access it in my code is exactly the same you would access it in Rails. Rails and Sinatra automatically have a environment hash, and you can access any environment variable. So this would be GitHub ID. And I'll use the same one down here. I'm live coding all this stuff. This is kind of crazy. So many mistakes that I could be making. I am making. Oh well. If I did this wrong, then my whole app won't work properly, but let's just double check it before I push up my code so that you all have access to it. Does everybody get the importance of this step? That client secret is how you made a secure web request because only you as a developer has access to that client secret. If anybody else has access to that client secret, they can generate these access tokens. regardless of whichever application it is. So OAuth is all about going back and forth, just trying to make sure that nobody can do what we just did. Only you as a developer or your team can do this. So I already killed my server. I'm going to go ahead and restart it. I'm going to pull open my browser over here, and I'm going to click Authorize GitHub, and you can see it's still working. So there's a lot of things you can do to improve this code, which we are going to do. But first, I'm going to push up this example code. Oops. Git commit and GitHub OAuth example. So now, if you go to the same GitHub repo that is linked in Discord, you have access to all of my code. And I want to give you all some time, maybe until, I don't know, 3:20, 3:25, to just practice doing this. So here's some instructions. Let me kill these. I hate all these embeds that come in Slack and Discord. So you're basically following along, building an application. Some of you probably have already done that. If you already have your client ID and your client secret, you can just copy and paste those lines, obviously change the underscores. If you feel more comfortable using a gem or .env file or whatever, do that. And I have a link to the GitHub repository, so you can check out my exact code. You can clone it. You can do whatever you want. And then there's a link to following it step by step. I redirected to the home page. Instead of redirecting to the home page, you can just stay on this page and just render ERB the same way I rendered ERB above. So if you wanted to, you can render the username. You can render the, I'll show you that code right now. So I'm giving you guys time to work, but if anybody's curious, you could do something like this. Once I have that data, instead of redirecting, I'll go ahead and push up this code in a second too. Say data equals parse at name equals this. I'm only doing this because if you're not familiar with Sinatra, it's a little different obviously than Rails, but very, very similar in concept. I have a tar URL. This is stuff that I saw from my terminal. I had a name and I had an avatar URL. Here's my name is Peter Jang, and the avatar URL is down here. So then I can just render some ERB, and I'll push this up in a second. H1, name is, and you can use ERB, obviously, the same way you would do with Rails. And if anybody's looking at this and saying, wow, this is crazy, why would you do all of this stuff inline? Shouldn't you make separate ERB files? You absolutely should. You should. Where? Image. I think that'll do the trick. And, I don't know, somebody's unmuted right now. If somebody wants to make sure that they're staying muted. All right, I don't mind. TV show sounds interesting. Rails, sorry, let me run my server again. And now I hit refresh, authorize GitHub, and I should redirect off of this page. I shouldn't have that code just lying up there on the top of the screen, but this just gives you an example. Once you have the data, you can render the data, you can make further web requests. So I'll push this example up as well. And like I said, we'll work on this till like 3:20, 3:25. So y'all can try this.
You might want to manually mute Alex.
There is Alex. There's a lot of people here.
The only person with unmuted microphone in the list.
Alex Gaudiosi.
All right. So like I said, I wanted y'all to have some time to work on this, but let me push up this code, git status, git diff. Git commits, change or show data in. So again, you have linked to my GitHub repo. So everything that I've done, you have access to. It's like 30 lines of code. This is still not correct. You really ought to redirect to a different page, but if you redirect to a different page, we've introduced a new wrinkle, which is my access token. Where do I put my access token? And the answer is you need to put it in a cookie or something. You can't just be passing it around in query parameters, and your cookies are going to be secure. So while you guys are working, feel free to use Discord to ask questions. And also feel free at this point, if you needed to unmute yourself, to ask me questions. Everybody is actually capable of sharing their screen. If anybody wants to help double check something, I'm happy to take a look.
I'm curious, is every implementation of OAuth like Shopify, GitHub, and I don't know, Google, Facebook, is the same URLs? Or do they use the same patterns, or is it different for each implementation?
It's going to be different for each implementation. Most of it's going to feel the same. But like even in some of these things, a lot of them are going to be like authorization bearer access token and this, that, like everybody's going to have slightly different implementations of OAuth. So there is a standard and the terminology is going to be the same. You're going to see access token and code and client ID and all that kind of stuff. But the nuance of each application, some of them will require base64 encoding of your data. Like everybody sort of handles it slightly different. Google, I would say, has a pretty strict implementation of OAuth with like, it's just really hard to even register an application. So hopefully we get a chance to do it, at least for 2 different providers. But yeah, that's a great question. It is a standard and there's certain things that are standard about it, but there's little nuances. And you basically doing OAuth, once you understand the concept, is just reading the documentation super carefully. What's a required parameter? What's an optional parameter? And what's the name of these things? And does it go in the header? Does it go in the body? All that kind of stuff is where you'll see a lot of nuance.
Good. Thanks.
I have a question.
What's up?
So for this to be completely secure, you have to have the whole thing needs to be SSL encrypted, correct? Because someone can sniff the access token when it gets back from the provider.
Right. Like right now we're using localhost, which is not on HTTPS. And so obviously this isn't, a secure, this is just for development purposes, but yeah, you would have to deploy your application and use all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to give you guys some resources. There's a lot of ways where OAuth can be hacked the same way any application that can be hacked with cookies, with, forms, with any of that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of nuance that you have to pay attention to. So that's not necessarily the focus of what I'm teaching here, but I will provide you a lot of really great documentation of like all the different attack vectors, which is why, incidentally, some people are like, well, yeah, it's cool that you know how to do it, but I'd rather use something like OmniAuth and Devise because they've already planned for all of those attack vectors, and to which I would say you absolutely should. This workshop isn't about, this is how you should build your code. This workshop is about, this is so you can understand how all of your code is working under the hood. If you're using something like Devise, you really need to understand authentication properly to use Devise properly. If you're using OmniAuth, OmniAuth is fantastic, but this shows you, if you needed to implement a new provider for OmniAuth, like there's a new service that comes out and you don't have that provider for OmniAuth, you don't have to wait for somebody to make it. You can look at how people make those providers because you understand how all of those, you have to understand how all of those pieces work.
So what you're demonstrating kind of is like, this is like under the hood of what OmniAuth is implementing specifically for the GitHub provider.
Yep. So OmniAuth, if anybody's familiar with OmniAuth, OmniAuth is a gem, and then there's a bunch of like provider gems, right? You have to use OmniAuth GitHub if you want to use the GitHub implementation. You have to use OmniAuth Google. If you crack open that gem, maybe we'll have some time to look at that. If you crack open that gem, you're just going to see this, right? OmniAuth is a gem that has all the security built into it, but each individual provider is just like, I just need to know what their authorization URL is. And I need to know, how am I supposed to embed this information? And so you're just providing OmniAuth that information, which means you'll be able to create a new provider if you wanted to, and you don't have to know all that security because that's built into OmniAuth. So yeah, it's cracking under the hood. In case you can't use OmniAuth for whatever reason, you'd be able to do this stuff on your own, but you definitely want to follow best practices with all the security things. And I'm not going to claim to be a security expert, but there's plenty of resources for for just seeing all the different attack vectors, CSRF, all that kind of stuff that you may or may not be familiar with from Rails. But just using some of those well-established gems, then you'll get those security practices built in. So this is really just cracking under the hood and understanding what's going on with it.
Are there any good ways to show this authentication and authorization window in kind of pop-ups without redirection for modern Web 2.0 single-page applications?
Yeah, I have to take a look at that. There's lots of different spin-offs of the OAuth protocol. We'll get a chance to take a look at that documentation in Spotify, which we'll look at next. And then they'll show you, hey, there's the authorization grant flow, there's this flow, and there's a lot of different options that you have, which might be a better fit for what you're describing. I see your question, John. I'm not really sure if the GitHub billing has a different login or service, but really we'll talk about this as we get deeper into this. It's a question of, when I made this request, I basically made this in the most simplest way possible. Oh, somebody's already getting into the rerun. Yeah, we'll do the rerun, Gem, if you're sick of restarting your Rails server. But what's it called? So the implementation of OAuth I basically just said, give me the most basic set of permissions possible. You as a developer, you can decide what permissions you're requesting for your application. So I don't know if anybody's ever installed an Android app or any kind of OAuth. If you log in, they're like, hey, do you want to give this person, Netlify, Peter X. Chang, or whoever, access to your GitHub so that they can create repos, delete repos, add comments, all that list of permissions? You can build an application that specifically requests certain permissions, which we're going to see later on in this workshop. All righty, y'all. I think what we're going to do is maybe I'm going to run to the bathroom and I'll be back in a minute or two. And once I get back, then I think we'll go ahead. I want to show you how do you actually redirect properly, because the way the app is right now is a little bit awkward. You're staying on this callback page and stuff like that, where you need to introduce cookies. And if you're not familiar with Sinatra, there's a specific way of doing that. And then we'll take a look at how to implement this again using a different provider. Really, it's just getting used to the documentation and doing different providers. But really, this part of the workshop, you've already unlocked, most of what you need to understand from an OAuth perspective. But yeah, I'll be back in about a minute or two, and then we'll move forward. All righty. Yeah, there's a lot I want to cover. So, I mean, even though we're kind of done, could just end it right here, but no, there's a lot I want to cover. So yeah, let's take a look at one is how I would do a redirect out of this page. So in order to do that, basically, once I have this access token, I don't want to do all of this. I want to save this access token in a session. So if you're familiar with Rails, you can save stuff into a session, which is a cookie that's secure, and then you can redirect to /profile. I want to do everything that I did over here, but not on this URL. In order to use a session, you literally have to enable it, enable sessions. So you don't have to follow along. We'll do a different exercise where you're going to do this all again in Spotify. And then I'll basically cut all of this code and put it into get /profile. Do an end. And here the access token is going to be from my session access token. If somebody is familiar with Sinatra, then you'll probably know that this is a little bit oversimplified. There are certain things that you have to do to make your sessions persistent and secure, but this is good enough for this example. Yeah. Basically, nothing's changed. I'll kill my server, restart it, go back over here, start the whole process over again. It says authorize GitHub. And then from the user's perspective, they don't see that code. They don't see that callback URL. They should never really see that. They just go get redirected to whatever page you want them to go to. So nothing's really changed. I'm printing a lot of stuff on my terminal, but the user doesn't see that. They just see this and they're like, oh, now I'm on my profile page. Now I can do this and now I can do that. So the whole OAuth process happens behind your back, really. Right? And you'll notice that I'm not going to GitHub because I'm already signed into GitHub and I've already been authorized. Like it just takes me straight here because I've already done that first authorization process. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this code. You don't have to do this. We're literally going to do an example of this, but you can take a look at it if you want to on GitHub, git status, git commit, change display data on separate page. Again, in order to do that, you have to save your access token and you have to save it in a cookie. I guess I shouldn't say you have to, but you have to save it in a secure location. If anybody has access to that access token, you're done. They have the users, essentially their username and password. The whole reason we did this is to keep that access token secure, right? You don't want to put this access token in a query parameter in the URL. You don't want to put this and expose this in any way, shape, or form. You literally spend all this time making a secure access token that only you can generate, that only you have access to. That's really the number one thing to understand about OAuth and the ways that people will try and hack you is so that either they can generate an access token or they're going to steal your access token, right? If they have your secret, then they can generate an access token. If you didn't store this in a proper way, or if they can hack into your cookies, then they can steal the access token that you made. Either way, you're going to be in trouble from a security perspective. All right, so I'm going to do this all over again, which seems redundant, seems not necessary, but you know, if you want to get good at OAuth, you should understand how to do it using multiple providers. So I'm going to close the GitHub stuff. We'll keep that open. We'll keep my Sinatra app over here. And let's take a look at the Spotify documentation. So Spotify says you will do OAuth, and Spotify actually has pretty good documentation, but it's sort of that intense kind of like, oh, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on over here, but it's going to be the exact same steps. So I think Dorian, somebody was asking like, what are the different steps? First, you're going to make a web request. It's a slightly different URL, but you're starting the process the same. You have to provide a client ID. You have to set a response type to code. We didn't have to do that for GitHub. It's weird. It's required, and it just says response type is code. And that's because there's different, what they call flows for OAuth. And the one we're using is the code flow, which is the most secure way of doing it. And there's other slightly less secure ways of doing it that they had built that they don't necessarily recommend. The protocol has other things, and we'll come back to that. It's also required that you provide the redirect URI. So I'm just going to go ahead and start building this. First, I'm going to create an app for Spotify. Let me Slack this link out to you if you want to follow along. Sorry, not Slack. I keep saying Slack. Discord it. So if you don't have a Spotify account, then I wouldn't worry about it. Just go ahead and you can just watch what I'm doing. But once you're on your Spotify developer account, you can create a new developer application. If you've never used Spotify's API before, Spotify's API is so cool. You can search for songs, you can get like audio clips, you can do all these things. And they turned it from, I think it used to be a public API, and then they required OAuth in order for you to access it. But there's so many cool things you can do with Spotify. It's a great API. So I'm going to create an app. My app name is going to be test application. I understand the terms and services. I don't think I need a description. I click create. I guess I do need a description. Test application for Rails. And I'm sort of done. I have my client ID and my client secret, but I'm not done. You always have to provide the redirect URI. Otherwise, your app will not redirect back to the same place. So this is kind of weird. You have to go back and edit the settings. And all the way down here, not all the way down here, you have to add a new redirect URI. If you're not familiar with the terminology, a URI is a URL. A URL is a type of URI. A URI is a broader term, uniform resource indicator. Oh, I forget the terminology. That's bad. But I need to add my HTTP localhost 4567. And it doesn't have to be callback. It could be whatever you want. If you're used to using OmniAuth, it would be auth/Spotify/callback, but it could be whatever URL you want to put in there. I click add, and then you have to hit save. I just want to make that clear because this really messed me up the first time I did this. I went into Spotify, I created an application, I have a client ID and I have a client secret, no problem. I clicked edit settings and I said http://localhost 4567/callback. And I clicked add and I thought I was done, but you have to click save. It's ridiculous. Like, I don't know. So I thought I saved my redirect URL and I didn't, and whatever. So many things that can go wrong in this process. And again, it's kind of insane that I'm trying to live code this stuff, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. No code references, so whatever, save. So I set up my application. I have my client ID and I have my client secret. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in my environment variables. I'm going to kill, I have an extra tab here. I don't know why. That's fine. I'm going to kill this. I'm going to say export Spotify client ID. Export Spotify client secret. I'm going to show the client secret. Please don't do anything crazy with this. I'm going to kill this as soon as this recording is done. As soon as this workshop is over, I'm going to kill this stuff. So now I have access to my environment variable, Spotify ID, Spotify client secret. And I'm going to go ahead and build a new app. Require Sinatra. Get /do end ERB. I'll make a link. href equals authorize /a. Make sure I don't have any typos. That's a lot of coding that I just did in a short amount of time. Ruby Spotify example.rb. Go back over here. Okay, so far so good. Some of you already mentioned this. It's in the Discord, and I'll send it out in a bit. Gem install rerun. Oops. Gem install rerun. It's a separate gem altogether, and you go rerun, and then Ruby Spotify example.rb. That will essentially give you the same functionality that Rails gives you out of the box. Anytime your code changes, it will restart your server. It's not quite as graceful as Rails. Rerun has nothing to do with Sinatra. So sometimes you can refresh your page and you're in the middle of it restarting the server and it crashes and it can make you confused. But for the most part, this works great. So I will send that out, but this is in the Discord. Somebody already mentioned that because they were tired of restarting their applications. All right, so the first part of OAuth is making a link. This link doesn't go anywhere. So where should it go? According to Spotify's documentation, it needs to go here. So then I go there. I also need to provide client ID, and I need to provide response type, and I need to provide a redirect URI. So right off the bat, those are some optional parameters in the GitHub implementation, and these are required parameters. So I guess Spotify's trying to be a little bit more secure. Client ID is a string interpolation, env Spotify client ID. You'll notice that you don't put your client secret in here because the web request that I'm making right now is insecure. It's just a link. Anybody can see that link. So that means anybody can see your client ID. So your client ID is not a secret piece of information. Your client's secret is. Response type is set to code. There's no changing that unless you wanted to use a different version of OAuth's implementation. And the redirect URI is http://localhost 4567/callback. You don't need this. It's really just an extra security layer. It's not much of one, but it's basically saying, make sure that you're sending me the redirect URI, and if it doesn't match what I have, then I'll reject your app all, straight up. So it's just an extra layer of security to make sure that whoever's making this web request actually is you. It's not a huge security thing. Okay. That's step one of OAuth. I click on that link and it takes me to log into my Spotify app. I'm done with step one. And if I click agree, I arguably am done with step two. Step two is happening on Spotify's side. They are sending me back to this. The moment you see this, I know this looks like a failure, but this is a tremendous success. It means I've got the code. And I need to just do one more web request to make it into a secure access token. If it's not clear, there's a different OAuth implementation where they're like, no, we'll just give you the access token right here and right now. It's not recommended, especially if you're using the web. But some people requested it because they're like, but what if I'm on a mobile app and I can't do this? If you have some more restrictions, then they're like, I still want a way to do that. So they're like, fine, here's a version of OAuth that is far less secure. If you know what you're doing, we'll send you the access token, but it's really not recommended. So this the way we're doing it right now is a secure way of implementing OAuth. Okay, so then I just have to do the last part. Get /callback, do an end, response equals http://post. And here I need to implement step two, which is post to this URL. And again, somebody asked, are they the exact same URLs? Not necessarily. And this one is JSON by default, so I don't have to request or configure any headers, but I do need to configure the form parameters. Form parameters, like client ID. No, I guess I don't need the client. Oh, I do need the client ID. Yeah, so this is important. I only need to provide three things, which is grant type, which they said is code, authorization code, not code. The code, which is from params code, that's the one that I have in my URL. The redirect URI, which I already had over here. And I should be done, but I also have to add in my headers, authorization, basic, and then I have to base64 encode the client ID and the client secret. You've got to send the client ID and the client secret. That's the whole point of this process. And so the way they're requesting the client ID and the client secret is totally different than GitHub's. You will literally have to do a base64 encoding of your client ID and your client secret, which is like even a more secure way, because putting stuff in your headers is a little bit more secure than putting stuff into your body. They do give you the alternative though, and I'm just going to do that for right now. If you want, we can go over how to base64 encode things. But does everybody get this? I'm showing you this because the implementation is slightly different. We did successfully implement OAuth in the absolute simplest form. But then when you jump to a different provider, you're like, you have to read the documentation super carefully and understand what those nuances are, right? But let's just do it the same way we did before. They said you can put it in the body. I guess they don't want you to, but you can. And my client ID is from my environment variables. And my client secret is here. And then I'll pp response.parse and it redirects to /. If it's not clear, this is how I recommend if you're ever going to do this from scratch, you've got to do it in steps. You can't just implement the whole thing and then just watch it work. It won't. You've got to go in really tiny pieces and say, did this work? There's so many places where I could be making typos. If I didn't register the redirect URI properly, whatever. So my code automatically restarted. I can go over here, start this process again. I say authorize Spotify. It says do you want to authorize it? And yeah, I have an error. Line 8, I guess.
You did not require HTTP.
I'm sorry?
Oh, yeah. Sabrina. Require HTTP.
Yeah, I did that on purpose. I just want to make sure everybody's paying attention. No, that's awesome. Thank you so much. All right. That's why I feel comfortable live coding. I've got like a bunch of y'all here to watch my back. I agree. And it looks like nothing happened, but I have my access token. That's really the key. And I'm able to make web requests using Spotify. So I'm gonna let you just practice this using Spotify, but first let's finish this and do this the right way. Enable, I don't know, we don't have a huge amount of time. I guess I want to just demo some stuff, but let's do this the right way. Let's redirect to /profile, save this in a session, access token, response.parse, access token, super important here. I don't know how many people are super familiar with Rails, but Rails has a hash. It's called hash with indifferent access, and Rails doesn't care in your params if you use a string or a symbol. But the response that I got back is JSON, and all of my keys are strings, not symbols. Super easy to make a mistake when you use a symbol instead of a string or vice versa. So something to be very aware of when you're debugging this stuff. And then just for the sake of time, I already wrote some code for my profile. I'm going to grab the access token out of my session. And here's a similar profile URL that needs to be authorized. It has to be authorization bearer. This is all in the documentation. And I'll just grab the name out of it and display the person's name, which is not super interesting. But, authorize Spotify, agree, and it knows my name. And that will display the name of whoever logged into Spotify, not just me. So hopefully you all see how this is similar, very similar to the GitHub example. There's little slight nuances, and I want to go over those nuances in the time that we have. And even though this workshop technically ends at 4 p.m. Central, like you'd be able to do some exercises with what we have over here after I go over some of those nuances, because I've implemented the bare minimum of OAuth. I haven't talked to you about some of these optional parameters, which are important, right? In fact, if anybody who's a security expert is watching the way I'm implementing OAuth, they're like, you're missing some pretty big pieces right now, right? To make this as secure as possible. If you're familiar with building Rails apps, you should be familiar with CSRF tokens and making sure that your forms have a CSRF token embedded in them to make sure that people can't spoof your web requests. So that's exactly what's going on over here. I should be using that same type of protection. I should be generating a random token on my back end and making sure that I send it and I receive the same random token on my front end, or sorry, not on my front end, but when I get it back from the web request. So before I move forward, everything that I've done so far is literally an exact duplicate of what I did on GitHub. Now we're going to start doing some stuff that's slightly different. But I'll go ahead and push this code up because there's nothing insecure about it. So git status, git commits, add Spotify example. So you guys can reference this on GitHub if you wanted to take a look. But I want to dig into the documentation and see what are some differences. So going back to the top, the first web request says you must provide a client ID, a response type, a redirect URI, and state. State is optional, but strongly recommended. This provides protection against attacks such as cross-site request forgery. So what I need to do is generate a random string and set it equal to my state and double check that I got it back. It would basically look like this. So going back to step one, everything was fine, but I'm going to add and state equals random string. That's horrible. I shouldn't just make a random string called random string. I should actually make a random string, but bear with me. Down over here, when I make that request, I'm going to get back the code, and I'm going to get back the exact same state that I sent, which seems redundant. But this way you can make sure, hey, I'm the one who generated that and I get back the same state. That must have come from me. My server is the one who generated that random code. And so what you're trying to do is prevent somebody else from being able to generate this link. All right. So over here, you can add some code like redirects to / if params states not equal to random string. So when I first did this web request, let me just show you what that looks like. What if I didn't have the callback URL? I just want to show you. So if I'm over here, I'm back to the beginning and I click authorize Spotify, I agree. Spotify sends me back a code. And Spotify also sends me back the same state that I gave it. And this helps make sure that that came from your server, as opposed to like if somebody else tried to do it, they don't know what that random string was supposed to be, which of course you should not call random string. So now that I'm here, I'm going to bring back this URL and I'm going to say, hey, if the param state doesn't match the string that I started off with, that's no good to me. That's no good to me. Get me out of here. All right. So that's one thing that you can do to make this more secure. This is not good. It shouldn't be called random string. It should be more like this, something like this. Session state, save your random string. So here's a way you can do this in Ruby is use the secure random library to generate a random hex string. Save it in your session. So now it's part of my cookie. And again, I'll push this up. There's my random string. I don't even know what it is. This is exactly what Rails does with CSRF tokens. It generates a CSRF token and it embeds it in your form. And when you submit the form and you get it back, it's going to double check that it matches whatever it's saved. And it's doing it all behind your back. So you're responsible for implementing this. If I leave this alone, you should see this is going to reject because my random session state is not going to match. So going back to my server, go back over here. If I authorize Spotify and I click agree, it doesn't take me to the right page. It takes me back home. It doesn't make any web requests. So long as I make this match session state. So if you implement OAuth from scratch, what I am doing right now is something you absolutely must do. Now, must is a strong word. So then I get back my code. Sorry, what did I implement? I have to go to profile. So then it takes me to my profile. That, by the way, is the downside to the rerun gem. Sometimes you get caught before it finishes refreshing it. So then this does make the secure web request. It does match that random string. So this is an extra security feature of OAuth, which is the same concept that you might have learned from Rails. So that's one thing. Another thing is scope, which over here, scope is optional. A space-separated list of scopes. If no scopes are specified, authorization will be granted only to publicly available information. So what you can do in Spotify is once somebody logs in with their Spotify account, you can enable your app to create playlists as that user, delete playlists as that user, or whatever permissions. This is you defining what permissions you want to use. So I have a couple that I found from this documentation. So these are all different strings that you can say. Do you want the user to be able to modify your playlist? Do you want them to be able to follow you? Do you want them to be able to modify their library? All that kind of stuff. You add that to that first query, to the query parameters of your first URL. So yes, this URL is looking hideous. And no, I should probably not have this all in one big line. I should probably separate this out somehow and build my, construct my URL, but such is life. Over here, I'm going to add scope, and this is just one big string. This is not Ruby code, this is a URL. Wait, before I add that, let me commit my code. Status, diff, git commit, use state for increased security. So then back over here, there we go. I'm adding the scopes. And so that now when I log in with Spotify, nothing really else changes, but the user is going to see, hey, are you sure you want to authorize that particular application? Because it's asking if you want to modify your playlists and stuff like that. If you go back to the app and you start that process, this is new. You're going to see some more information up front that says, hey, are you really allowing them to do this? Do you really want them to be able to see all of your files and things like that? All right. So let me go ahead and that's all you really need to do. Git add, git commit, use scopes for increased permissions. Yeah, what else do I want to do? I guess I'll leave it up to you as an exercise. I'll push up this code, but I mentioned that there's a different way you can embed your client secret and client ID. They basically require you to base64 encode this and put this in your authorization headers. This step over here, instead of putting it in the body, they request that you put it in your headers, and they let you do it both ways. It's not hard to do it, but you'll have to do, use a base64 encoding library. And I will push up an example of that because there's a nuance to it. If you use base64 in Rails, there's it's base64 URL safe or something like that. So if you're not familiar with base64 encoding, you've probably seen it with images. Sometimes you have a really small image, and instead of actually linking to an image that lives on some server, you literally take the image and turn it into a giant string. You take a big blob of data and turn it into a giant string. That's base64 encoding. But here I have the base64 encode it and make it safe for URLs and not use any special characters. I'll do that later. I know we don't have that much time. So there is one more thing that I want to show you, which I mentioned, which is Spotify's documentation. Starting at the top, it says, there are 4 optional flows to obtain using app authorization. We did the authorization code flow. There's refreshable user authorization, which is part of authorization code flow. There's temporary user authentication, which is called implicit grant, and refreshable app authorization. If you look at any of these things, they're very, very similar. Once you understand how to use this, it's very similar. So here, this is something that I mentioned before. Instead of doing this giant process, which is what we did, the implicit grant flow is an alternate OAuth implementation that stops right there, which is a lot less secure. It's carried out client side and does not involve secret keys. So if you don't have a backend server, you can't send around your client secret. That can only live securely on a backend. So what if you had an app that was just a front-end application? There is no backend, right? Then they're like, fine. Here's how you implement OAuth. Instead of asking for response type code, you ask for response type token. That's it. I'm going to comment this out just so you can see what's going to happen. So again, instead of response type code, you change that to response type token. And I'm only doing this now because I don't think you should do this, but you know. So let's say I just had a front end. All you do is you make this link and you authorize Spotify and you're done. And I don't know if you guys can see this URL very clearly. Let me go back to, I shouldn't copy and paste this. It sends me back to my callback, but it adds a hash fragment with literally the access token in the URL. There are no extra steps. You cannot access a hash fragment using params. You have to use JavaScript to pull out that hash fragment. So if you had a front-end application that had no backend, then you can't do what we've been doing. So that OAuth has this alternate sort of flow, but it's generally, from what I read, is highly not recommended. If there's other ways you can pull this off, you should do that. There's another alternative to OAuth where it's like, what if you just wanted to communicate between servers and you didn't have a front end, right? Then you can't send a link and then they can't log into it. And that's another sort of deeply limited version of OAuth, because if the user can't sign into their app, then what can you really do? That's interesting. So there's different, standards that OAuth has to handle these different types of situations. So that's most of what I wanted to cover. I know I kind of rushed a couple of pieces of this. I'm not going to commit this last chunk of my code because, again, I don't think the grant type is something that you should be using, but it is something that you should be aware of. And what I'm hoping that you get from all of this is that when you come back to, looking at slides like this, like we've covered a lot of the terminology here. And something like this is like wildly confusing. If you just somebody said, go implement this, but there's the authorization code request. They're making a nuance between who's the resource owner versus who's the client. The resource owner is the person who's actually logging in. The client is the app that you're building. I sort of simplified that. There's authorization server and resource server. This is both GitHub or this is both Spotify, but they could live on two different servers. They could be two different applications, or they could be the same application. So there's a lot of nuance to the OAuth specification. But if you go back to thinking about this in a simplified form, I'll provide these slides in the GitHub README. You know what I mean? This is essentially what you need to understand to implement OAuth. And then you can go in and really dig into the specification or really dig into some source code if you wanted to look into OmniAuth or those different types of things. And you'll be able to sort of say, okay, this is the information that I need. This is how I keep things secure. And what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to, just for the sake of posterity, I'm going to add to this README some of the resources that I mentioned, like if you wanted to learn about OAuth security and how can people hack your cookies and how can people do this kind of stuff, I can add those resources in here as well. But yeah, between these two chunks of code, and the reason why I chose Sinatra is because it's like 36 lines of code. So if you really wanted to study this, like everything is here. You don't have to be jumping around between routes and trying to figure out what's connected to what. That's the hardest part of OAuth to me, is there's so many different web requests. You can't really see where everything's connected, right? But here, hopefully everything is very straightforward. And let's say you use a different callback URL, then you obviously can change this, and then you can modify this and sort of make it work the way you would want to. So we didn't have enough time for another exercise, but the exercise would be, build the Spotify app, except actually use Spotify's API. Like I said, they have an amazing search API where you can pull down music and artists and albums and pictures and all that kind of stuff. It's super cool. It's worth mentioning that everything that I did here is actually based on a course that I had built earlier called OAuth 2.0 Deconstructed. It is a paid course, but I'd be happy to send out a coupon for anybody who's interested. You really don't. Everybody who attended the session probably doesn't need that course because you've covered the meat and potatoes in here. But in that course, I do this one more time using Google's OAuth implementation, and Google's it's not any harder from the code's perspective, but it's a lot harder to just register for an app. There's just a crazy number of steps that you have to do where it's like you're signing up for a project, then you sign up for an app, and then you sign up for this. And there's just a lot more security around it. Even after you're done signing up for an app, they just changed it so that you have to say, well, if it's a test app, only these emails are allowed to even access your test app. There's just so much more ceremony to registering an app. So hopefully you guys can make that comparison between, the simplest implementation of OAuth that I found, which is GitHub. Everybody has a GitHub account. It's super easy to practice, starting to Spotify, which is a little bit more in-depth, and then to Google, which is, one of the more in-depth implementations. But once you can do those three, then you'll be able to sort of have a much deeper understanding of all the stuff, and you'll be able to study it and understand all the terminology and be able to use higher level libraries with a lot more confidence. Yeah, so we don't have too much more time. I will send out some of that information, but like I said, the key thing to take a look at is going to be this repository. I'm going to add all of the resources in here because I know the conversations can get buried in Discord. I will Slack out, this is the course, and there's a coupon code in there if you wanted to have a discount. And if somebody can't afford it at all, like I said, this talk is recorded. You'll be able to go back, and I know I had to sort of rush through some of these pieces. You'll be able to go back and reference them. And a lot of the material that I covered in this talk is the same as this course. So I don't know if you need that course, but if you did want to see it another time and be able to, reference it to other people, it can be a useful resource. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll add more resources in here. There's a lot of really great resources I found in terms of security surrounding OAuth. Some of y'all have brought up some of those things. When you implement things from scratch and you simplify things, you're basically sacrificing all of the security that you need to do. You know what I mean? If you're using Sinatra, and if you really tried to build an app using Sinatra, which is a cool framework, there's all the security that you're going to be missing that comes with Rails, right? And so it's super important that you understand that if you did choose to implement something like this on your own. If you implement stuff like this with OmniAuth, then you have to understand the trade-offs. The trade-offs is you're adding more dependencies. OmniAuth depends on a bunch of different gems, and you have to maintain those dependencies. The plus side is you're working with a well-maintained library that is handling all of those security best practices, right? So it's a very important trade-off to think through anytime you're dealing with this in production. Before this workshop is over, I don't know if there's any questions or comments. I'll be happy to stick around for a little while.
Yes, I do have a question.
Yeah, what's up,
yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for this. This was really simple, really elegant, as I said in the chat. Thanks for that presentation.
Absolutely.
So I was just wondering, there are some private companies like doing all of this, like Auth0 is one of them.
Yeah.
We use it in my company. So I was wondering, like, well, I guess the answer is pretty much like they do all of these best practices for authorization, authentication, all of that jazz. Is there anything else they provide that you would think or would say that, yeah, it's worth it to use it as, like an implementation like this or something like OmniAuth?
Yeah, so when it comes to OAuth, and I am not a security expert, so take everything with a grain of salt. When it comes to OAuth, I think OmniAuth is a great implementation, and you should feel comfortable using that. When it comes to something like Auth0, what they're really offering is something similar, like if you were to implement credit card processing with Stripe, right? Which is, I don't want to be managing people's credit cards, right? Like I don't want to worry about my database security in case I get hacked. So Auth0 says, hey, forget OAuth for a second. What Auth0 is saying, you don't have to manage people's passwords. I know it's not difficult to make a Rails app and do a password digest and do bcrypt or even use Devise or anything like that. But in the end, your users' passwords are being stored in your database, right? And so Auth0 is like, we'll accept the legal responsibility for that, and we're going to make sure that information stays secure. So if you're implementing a normal email password sign-up flow, I think something like Auth0 has a lot of great benefits, especially for small companies where you don't have the security experts to make sure that you have all of those pieces. But if you're using OAuth, that you're sort of getting that, right? Like I don't have to manage people's Google. If I can build an app and say the only way you can log into this application is by using Google, right? Then I'm not managing people's usernames and passwords. So I'm basically getting that very similar benefit, and I can use a gem like OmniAuth, and I don't have to worry about the security of my database because I have 0 usernames and passwords. So the way you would implement this, if you just wanted to use OmniAuth or OAuth for that example, is you build a database of users, and you can have the usernames, you can have their user emails, but no passwords. You use OAuth and make sure that they log in there. And when you get back the token and you can make sure that that user matches the user that's in your database, then they're authorized. And there's no way they can get through that process unless they actually logged in and got back that token. So you're basically built an app where you're not responsible for, for passwords. So in that situation, if you don't have a normal login flow, something like Auth0, what they're saying is, hey, we're handling the passwords and making sure they're secure. We're handling password resets. We're handling all of that whole interface stuff that you don't have to worry about. In that case, I think something like Auth0 actually does make a lot of sense, especially for apps that are at scale where you have to really worry about those security concerns. But if it's just OAuth, I don't know. My gut feeling is OmniAuth might get you pretty far if you don't have to worry about those pieces.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So then I have a couple of hands. I guess Andy.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Auth0 and Okta and other providers like that can also implement new features for you, like passwordless logins for users and other things, and all of the security behind it that you don't have to worry about.
Right.
And then you can add those features to your user logins when they become available. So.
Yeah. And I guess the best answer is always, it depends, like what's the scale of your application. But like when it comes down to like eventually if your app becomes popular, you've got to be worried about that security. And Rails almost makes it too easy for you to build an application where you're like, yep, I've got secure passwords, they're hashed, with bcrypt and all of that kind of stuff, and I'm good to go. And you don't have any clue of all the attack vectors, like crazy attack vectors, like people writing scripts to log into your app. I think Devise has this protection built in, but it's like writing scripts to log into your app and timing how long it takes to come back. And it's like, well, if they found a match in the database, then it's going to take shorter amount of time than if it didn't find a match versus this versus that. Just crazy things that you would never imagine. And so you really have to be on top of the security stuff. And something like Auth0 is, they're basically saying, hey, instead of you dedicating an entire engineering team to working on that, it might be worth it for you to use our service where we've already, built it out and turned that into a service.
And we're actually looking at Okta versus Auth0. But for the reason that we're doing it is because we're actually building an ecosystem of applications that we want users to have access to, but we only want them to have to log in once to gain access to all of the different apps that are in our ecosystem. And so doing that is beneficial as well. Pulling your user authentication out into its own service that any app would use to authenticate users, rather than baking it into each individual application.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Andrew, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think Daniel's next.
Yeah, Daniel.
Oh, I'm done. Sorry.
All right, cool.
Okay. Yeah. So my question is kind of around that. Like what's the next step? Okay, we get like OAuth. Like, is this something that you use to identify your user? And so from the response you get back from GitHub, you take either the username from there or something like that, and that's proof that they are who they are. And then you create your own version of like a user on your own database, and then like that's your auth process, or?
Yeah. So the course that I slacked out, it's not that much more, but it goes into it. There are some people who are really familiar with OAuth who would be annoyed by this process of using OAuth for authentication. OAuth was designed to authorize people. So the nuance between that terminology is you're supposed to use OAuth so that you can log in into your GitHub account so that you can create new, GitHub repositories or do pull requests or make authorized web requests. It wasn't designed for you to just say, oh yeah, you're logged in. It wasn't meant to be a login system. It was meant to be an authorization system. So they added a specification on top of OAuth called OpenID Connect. I think I sent it out in the Discord, and I'll add a resource in there as well. And so what you're saying, Andrew, is like, oh, what if you just wanted their email from this whole process? Like, I don't really need the access token. I just need to know that they signed in and their email matches an email that's in my database. So then you're using the OAuth process for authentication. And again, I'll add some links to the README. So that is a different protocol called OpenID Connect, but it's literally the OAuth protocol with an extra piece. You basically say, hey, in this process, instead of sending me back an access token, I want you to send me back, I forget what they call it, a different type of token. And what it is, it's a JWT, if you're familiar with JWTs. And inside the JWT, it's base64 encoded, and you have to decode it to get their email out of it. So they built a very specific protocol just so that you can get the user's ID out of it, and that way you can use OAuth. Because when they first invented OAuth, everybody started using it for authentication. And they're like, wait, that's not really what it's there for. We gave you this access token. The access token doesn't have the user's info in it. You have to make another web request to get the user's info. Why are you using this for authentication? But everybody's like, hey, I don't have to deal with passwords anymore. So the idea of using OAuth for authentication is a very appealing one. So they added this extra specification on top. And all it is just basically saying, I don't need the access token. I need the user's information, and it's encoded in a JWT. That's the OpenID Connect standard. And it is what you're saying. Yeah, like you basically save users in your database with emails and no passwords, and you make them log in to the other service in order to authenticate them, and you'll get back their email so you could match it against your password. And it's a really nice, it's a passwordless system for you. The password is still there. You've just offshored that work to Google or GitHub or whomever.
Yeah, sweet. Thanks.
Cool. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Dinshaw?
Yeah, Dinshaw. Thank you.
Dinshaw, yeah.
Peter, great talk. Thank you very much. Just kind of following up on the Open Connect thing, the OpenID Connect thing. Do you know if that protocol, like out of the box, supports refresh and allow lists and deny lists? Like, is it full kind of emulation of session management, or is that still kind of stepping away from its intention?
Yeah, I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty sure the answer is no. Like, you're still required to, handle, blacklisting tokens and all that kind of stuff. All it is basically, and this is my understanding of it, all it is like, if you're using OAuth for authentication, you don't even need an access token, right? You just need the user's information. Once you get through this whole process, instead of getting back an access token so you can make authorized web requests, you just need the user's information in a secure way. That's the OpenID Connect protocol, is to say, instead of giving you back an access token, and you can do both, by the way, you can easily, so Google's implementation of OpenID Connect is the one that I go through, and I'll Slack out the documentation for it, or I'll add it to the README. All you're doing is you're saying, hey, I might want an access token for authorized web requests. That's OAuth. I might want this user information embedded in this JWT. That's OpenID Connect. Or I might want both. Send me the access token and their user information. But it's still up to you to decide how you want to use that information. All it's saying is, here's a secure way for me to prove you are who you say you are in this embedded JWT. That's the protocol.
Okay, cool. So as far as like trying to delineate between an OAuth 2 flow like we're describing, where it's just authentication, and pure JWT, the difference then is almost like semantic and comes down to kind of what's in the token?
Yeah, well, if you're using the OpenID Connect protocol, then you're going to get back, if you get back an access token, that's OAuth. If you get back, I think it's called an ID token, that's OpenID Connect. If you get back both, then you're using both. It's just literally, what is the information that you get back after you're done with this flow, right? If you get back an access token, the whole reason why you're getting back the access token is so you can make authorized web requests as the user. You know, you could delete somebody's playlist. You can do that. That's the reason why you got the access token. The reason why you want to get an ID token is so that I can say, hey, I need to check if you say you are who you say you are. So I would say that the simplified way of putting it is, if you get back an access token, you're doing OAuth. If you get back an ID token that it's a JWT that you have to decode, that's OpenID Connect. It's very, very similar in practice. You're almost writing the exact same code. You're literally just saying over here in your scopes, I want the ID token. Then you're also using OpenID Connect. It's like, it's so hard to distinguish that from a programming perspective. You're literally just doing this exact same process. The question is, what's the purpose of the code and what information are you getting back?
Cool, thank you very much.
Yeah. Alrighty, y'all. If there are no other questions, then yeah, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up this session. Like I said, you can I will add some more information into this README about some of that security stuff. And if anybody has any additional questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me. My Twitter handle is Peter X Jang. I'm not super active on Twitter, but I am there, and I definitely check my messages. So yeah, hopefully I'll learn something valuable from this. And yeah, feel free to reach out if there's any other things that I can help out with.
Round of applause.
Appreciate it.
Possible to do this virtually.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. So it's a tough. I've been teaching online for the past year or so, so it's I'm used to the awkward silence.
Yeah, silent ends are boring. Yeah.
No, but definitely appreciate it. Alrighty, like I said, I'll add some more resources to this README, and feel free to reach out if you have any other additional questions. Okay, take care, everybody.